We'd like to go into a bit of explanation and background on my fellow panelists. I would like to welcome Siham to sort of do the quick introduction for the next 10 or so minutes. Thank you.
For all the young scholars out there who are interested in Somali studies, this is incentive to join because you get treated like a rock star, obviously. So I want to thank, as always, I start every talk by thanking, every talk that Adan invites me to, by thanking her and Shama and the Somali Week organizers for constantly asking me back. Okay, I think we're ready. So when I was thinking about how to approach Somali studies at a crossroads as a theme, I thought about how do we locate it, how do we understand it, and what's the context behind it. I think there are many of us that have been working on these issues either for quite some time, or this is the first time that we've really been introduced to the wider debates that are out there. So I thought that just providing a bit of context, background, and relating it to other phenomenons in different disciplines would be a great way to kind of help us kick off the discussion later on. So when thinking about how to approach all the debates that have been raised recently about Somali studies, what we mean to ask is, first, how do we produce knowledge about Somali societies? What knowledge do we consider authoritative? What approaches in research have permanently affected the way Somalis see themselves? And I've watched these issues raised at different times, at different conferences, and in academic and non-academic spaces. And I've thought about my own research and my own position. It wasn't until I listened to a panel that recently happened at the Hargeisa International Book Fair, where academics and scholars were tackling the same theme on knowledge production in general. Many of them were Nigerian, and they really reminded me that these issues that we're all discussing in relation to Somali studies, they're not new, and that really there are debates in African studies more broadly that have been ongoing for quite some time. It was a perspective that I now believe needs to be discussed in relation to Somali studies. Particularly looking at the struggles and transformations that African studies and its associations, there's one here in the UK, just what those associations and those disciplines have exemplified in terms of how they approach power, privilege, and authority. Just a quick historical background. When we think about the rise of African studies, think of it like this. In 1957, Ghana gained independence. The African Studies Association in the US was also established that same year. Maybe it's a coincidence. But as successive states declared independence, many of them were born out of liberation struggles and emancipatory principles. Among these principles was the need to develop African higher education institutions to promote these ideals and to raise the scholarship of Africans at African institutions. The influence of African studies taught at Western universities was profound. Consider that I.M. Lewis's most seminal work, A Pastoral Democracy, was first published in 1961. So there was a lot of interest and a lot of fervor about what knowledge production meant and how can we now begin to understand where societies in post-independence, post-colonial African states were heading. Now, the lens that a lot of African studies scholars in the 50s and 60s based in Western institutions, the lens that they were using to understand African societies and the process of decolonization was through nationalism. In hindsight, the criticisms that arose for how nationalism was studied at the time by these same scholars echoes and is very similar to the criticisms that we're now raising in regards to Somali studies. The point was that national identities that were used to shape political processes had existed in pre-colonial Africa. They weren't national identities that all of a sudden arose in a vacuum or all of a sudden arose in the post-independence period. But many of them had their historiographies and their genealogies that could be traced to pre-colonial Africa even. As well, societies organizing themselves along social identities was nothing new. So I think this, for example, is one way of situating the tradition of Lewis's A Pastoral Democracy, because if you read it, there's really an emphasis on what a Somali nation state looks like and what the roots of a Somali nation state are. Also consider this another fun fact. Around the same time, the Somali National University in Mogadishu was established in 1954, and it gained university status in 1969. So we're beginning to get a picture that there was a lot of rapid development and movement towards producing African intellectuals. Now, it wasn't until the 1970s and 80s where some Africanist scholars based in Western institutions, where they suggested that, liberation struggles gave way to dictatorships and military rule, you all of a sudden had a different agenda. You had developmentalist and donor organizations like the World Bank that brought in the 1980s, structural adjustment programs. I'm only bringing that up because it had a profound impact on higher education in Africa in the late 1970s and 80s, mainly because it privileged and put a lot of money behind primary education. Many African leaders at the time as well saw public intellectuals as a threat to their rule, arguably precipitating many African scholars to emigrate to Western academic institutions. These same scholars and their presence at these institutions in some way helped to diversify the methods and the theories that were utilized to study Africa. For example, interdisciplinarity was beginning to be stressed, but the nation state at this time was still the dominant lens to try and understand African states and how we continue to produce knowledge about African societies. Somalis are not divorced from this. We would argue that clan and clan identities serve a similar purpose, where Somali society, where we begin to think and believe that Somali society begins and ends with just studying the shifts and the impact that clan has. Now, there's been many talks I've attended where someone stands up and says, enough of clan. I hope someone does that today too. In any case, I take, if I can quote Paul Zaleza on this, when he looked at the institutional practice of African studies, both at Western institutions and at higher education institutions on the continent, he said, ideologically, it has exhibited imperial, solidarity promoting, and liberatory tendencies. He isolates the higher education sector as the primary site responsible for disseminating, at the time, the decolonization visions of African leaders and public intellectuals. Now, with the emigration of African intellectuals, African studies in a lot of Western institutions became absorbed in broader area studies. And that obviously had its own criticisms. The most widely stated criticism being that area studies was born out of a need to understand the impact of the Cold War on Africa. and largely became a descriptive approach to African studies in the 1980s as well as 90s. But we can also understand, if we think about the developmentalist organizations and the donor organizations that have also contributed to how we understand knowledge production, we can say that since post-independence, many African states and higher education institutions in Africa have been impacted by transnational actors and ideas. In the same way as African states and societies during this time were viewed as developing or underdeveloped, Somali studies was equally being locked into a dualism and was generally seen through the prism of Somali society and Somali studies prior to the conflict and after the conflict. And that's just one way of trying to make sense of the scholarship that's out there about Somali studies. I don't want to limit all of the scholarship on Somali studies to just these two themes. But a lot of them, my research included, fall within this duality. But this duality is also a part of the reality of the conditions of Somali society, and partly a projection on our part of the methods that we think are useful to understanding transformations of Somali society in the Horn as well as in the diaspora. When we talk about, the rise of the Somali diaspora, many of us came as a consequence of the Civil War. So what does that say about how we locate our own history, not only in relation to those family members or those that still remained during the conflict and are still there now, as well as what we've set, the lives that we've now established for ourselves here. But still, transformations came in African studies. Postcolonial theories were especially influential because they introduced or they popularized the idea that voices and identities of postcolonial societies were consistently and historically written out of time. Meaning, when knowledge is produced about any one region, any one group or society, it's as if their history begins when we start producing knowledge about them. And whatever happened before we started producing knowledge about them in specific ways, for example, in academic institutions, then anything before that wasn't useful knowledge. It's much more complex and obviously much more nuanced than that, but I really do want to just tease out a lot of the broad strokes. Postcolonialism was born out of a need in general to research African history and epistemology through a critical lens. Postcolonialism advocates breaking and sometimes abandoning the categories we've utilized to study African societies. Now, during these changes, both in rhetoric, discourse, and in writing on Africa, many African studies scholars at Western institutions still cautioned against abandoning certain paradigms because they argued that they remained useful. They said that the concept of the nation state or nationhood, nationalism, is still valuable. And now we've got different disciplines that, including Marxist theories that suggest that, a lot of African studies research needs to incorporate class dynamics. And I'm a student of feminist security studies, so I'm already bringing feminist perspectives into my research on Somali society. Now, these perspectives were born out of a tension between needing to understand African societies from a transnationalist and globalist perspective versus continuing and seeking to emphasize the nation state. Finally, on critique and criticism of knowledge production. How does this impact, for all of that I've said, how does this impact the current debates we're having about Somali studies? The existing tensions in Somali studies scholarship, it didn't begin today, but these criticisms were present from the onset. My perspective on this has been to understand the context of these critiques in academic and non-academic spaces. For example, Applying critical theories to Somali studies can be difficult sometimes, since political processes in the Horn privilege economic liberalization and democratic governance. Critique for the sake of critique can also be empty if it isn't accompanied by reflection on our own positions. Another example, we can begin by asking, how do we relate to the debate in question? So what prism and what perspective are we already putting onto the debate? Not every critique is authoritative, and I've seen some really bad ones on Twitter. And not every authority in and out of academic spaces can offer meaningful critique. But the value in critiquing a theory, practice, or position is that it uncovers power, including who has the power to speak for any one group or society. When we offer a critique on a subject matter, any subject matter, we're instantaneously offering knowledge and actively producing it. This is what I believe the recent critiques of Somali studies has offered us. Participants across all fields and backgrounds offered their criticisms or their knowledge of what they perceived as norms, what was normal and accepted. Two instances stand out for me during the Hargeisa Book Fair panel on knowledge production. A university administrator stood and said that, as one critique, this was his critique. He said that the diaspora are disconnected from the struggle for higher education in the Horn and therefore not equipped to pass criticism or judgment on the partnerships that universities in the Horn seek to make with Western institutions. Another critique. A student from the University of Hargeisa at that same discussion said that ordinary students felt alienated from the criticisms coming out of Somali studies that were largely happening in the West. Now this is because the debate obviously was happening in English, and there was a lack. This individual also cited a lack of access to academic journals, and I pointed out to him, nothing's been written. Everything that's happened since I think the spring hasn't been put in academic journals yet. It's publicly accessible. But he gave us insight into, if we equate the critique and criticisms with actively producing knowledge, he gave us insight into how he can't access that knowledge. In the context of higher education, particularly in Somaliland, access is an important theme. There are public and private institutions that teach a variety of disciplines. And so fundamentally, what these two criticisms offered us was to ask, who do Somali and non-Somali researchers and scholars write for? Who is their audience? By virtue of speaking and writing in English, it certainly seems to be catered towards audiences outside of the Horn. What about the diaspora? Do they actively undermine the utilization of indigenous knowledge, whatever that means to you, by incorporating critical theories on research on Somali societies in the Horn? Alternatively, there are Somali-speaking authors whose poetry and research has been translated into English to widen access to their materials. As well, some Somali diaspora often build relationships with higher education institutions or local communities in knowledge exchange retreats. I'm returning to Zaleza again. On the topic of the African diaspora, he says, the African diaspora are useful in destabilizing the perception of Africa as static, where people and cultures are divorced from global culture. The diaspora, as a site of knowledge production, are actively shaping not only African history, but world history. In conclusion, knowledge also happens in everyday life. Somali studies has drawn heavily from categorizing the everyday life of Somalis living in the Horn. This produces knowledge. The advent of social media is another space where knowledge is produced, enabling the Somali diaspora to develop solidarity across disciplines and to share experiences. Somali youth living in the Horn are also active on Twitter and Facebook and engage with these debates. Knowledge production in general in the form of free-flowing ideas and people can be empowering. What is difficult to change and challenge are the structures of power. Higher education institutions, for example, seemingly have a monopoly on knowledge production. It is these spaces where much of the endeavor to challenge norms and power have been occurring in and out of the Horn. So occurring at Western institutions where African studies departments and classes are taught, as well as higher education institutions on the continent. So it's no wonder then that Somali studies is at another crossroads. And I hope that by relating our experience to other academic disciplines and African studies in general, we can begin to step outside of ourselves and frame our positions in a more global and historical context. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thanks to the organizers, to our chair. Thank you to Siham for really setting the context, I think, for what I'm going to talk a little bit about. She provided really the historical overview of the institutional development of African studies in the academy. She talked quite a bit about some of the imperatives underpinning knowledge production about Africa and some of the critical and analytical interventions that have taken place over time, and made a really important point that nothing that we've said is particularly new. It is new, however, for Somali studies. So I'll begin by talking a little bit about the Adan studies intervention, its origination, the analytical work it does, and a brief history of the debate as it's developed and played out over the last 6 months. Given the panel topic, Somali studies at a crossroads, I'd also like to reflect a bit on how the intervention has been received by non-Somali academics, researchers, and practitioners in Somali studies, and think through some of the logics at work. What I argue is that the reactions offer a window of insight into the very mechanisms of power and the relations of power Adan studies works to reveal. I make this argument more fully in an essay that I wrote recently that will be published in the next week or two, a documentation and analysis of my experience as a young Somali woman and graduate student who initiated a critique of institutional relations of power and how these relations of power then in turn manifest themselves in response to me and to Adan studies, which has thus far been one of silence, derailment, and harassment. The hashtag Adan studies, Adan meaning white in Somali as many of you know, began in late March with my call for a social media-based conversation using the hashtag following the launch of an academic journal called the Somaliland Journal of African Studies. It described itself as a journal covering, and this is a quote, African affairs at large, but with a particular focus on East Africa and the Horn, and put together with students and scholars of the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Hargeisa. Not one Somali academic or student was present on the journal's editorial board, board of advisors, and authors. The editorial and advisory boards were made up of 9 European and US-based academics, as well as 2 graduate student editors, and 3 Ethiopian academics affiliated with Addis Ababa University. On March 24th, I made a Facebook post, which circulated widely and was set to public in order to encourage discussion. I'll quote this comment directly. Inspired by the exclusion and erasure of Somalis from the new Somaliland Journal of African Studies, we're going to have a Twitter conversation tomorrow, March 25th, using the hashtag Adan studies and tweet to the journal's editor-in-chief. Adan is the Somali term for white, and the hashtag, or whiteness, and the hashtag captures important questions of power, authority, and knowledge production about the Somali territories, and how Somalis continue to be marginalized in academic and policy discussions concerning them and the Horn of Africa more broadly. Shortly after, one of the journal's advisory board members, a German anthropologist by the name of Marcus Huna, commented on the Facebook post and left multiple comments until he was asked to leave the thread. Among his comments were that Somalis are not marginalized in academia because there are no Somalis in academia, that he has not seen many Somalis who would qualify as serious scholars, and explained this as due to Somalis not valuing academic scholarship, that Somali students lack the work ethic to produce academic work, and that those of us who are making this critique are doing so because we are, and I quote, not looking beyond our Somali navels. The Twitter-based activism stretched out over days, and Somalis around the world were critiquing the ways in which Somalis are represented in academic work, media, and popular culture, sharing their own experiences of marginalization and how these representations have impacted their own lives, and asking critical questions of Somali studies and what it means as a field of study that relegates them to the role of objects of study and not its legitimate producers. An open letter to Marcus Huna and the Somaliland Journal of African Studies that I wrote, emphasizing the Adan studies' critique of power and knowledge production in Somali studies, and describing Huna's comments and the journal's exclusions as evidence of the validity of the critique and as signifiers of the field's current state, was signed by over 350 Somali academics, students, professionals, activists, and concerned community members, as well as non-Somali academic allies around the world. So what analytical work is Adan Studies doing? Perhaps the most important, seen in the very naming of the hashtag as a tongue-in-cheek inversion of Somali studies, and in its hybridity of both Somali and English, is that we Somalis are gazing back, speaking back, studying them, explaining them. It names the mechanisms of power sustaining non-Somali dominance over knowledge about Somalis. It destabilizes and displaces exclusive Western claims on universality and knowing that render Somalis partisan and fixed as innate objects of study. It historicizes Somali studies as a knowledge field inextricably linked to the historical processes of the colonization of the Somali. It highlights how colonial formulations continue and reincarnate themselves in the present, structuring how knowledge is produced about the Somali territories and the diaspora. It asks questions like what these histories and continuing processes mean for Somali representation and agency, both at the level of discourse and the capacity to access institutional power. It theorizes a vantage point, one of marginality, from which to engage and critique the academy, both from within, by those of us who are already here, but also by non-academics, who have asked who counts as a producer of knowledge. And that has, I think, been the most significant and I think incredible aspect of this movement, that it's spoken to and engaged people outside of the academy, democratizing the spaces in which knowledge is produced, disseminated, exchanged, and critiqued. It's also a critique, as Siham tells us, that's not particularly new. Adan Studies is about calling for a genealogy and analysis of power in Somali studies. And most of these debates have taken place in other area studies fields and related disciplines decades ago. For instance, Talal Assad's Anthropology and the Colonial Encounter, which was published in 1973 and looked at the colonial origins of anthropology and the relationship between knowledge production and colonial power. Edward Said did the same thing in his book Orientalism, which many of you are familiar with, in 1978, focusing on representation and the production of the Orient in Western culture as a manifestation of Western power. Robust scholarly traditions of casting a critical gaze upon historiography, historicizing, questioning, and unsettling identities, categories, and relationships that are fixed and essentialized in academic literature, and thinking through how these colonial discourses refigure themselves in more contemporary work, exist in other area studies fields and their disciplines. These conversations have happened and continue to happen in African studies. And so what Adan Studies asked is why this hasn't also been the case for Somali studies in 2015. So to be clear, the conversations generated by Adan Studies have always been about the question of institutional relations of power and not identity or authenticity politics. It raised the question of how knowledge about Somalis is produced and what the role of Somalis is in that knowledge production. We have emphasized this over and over on multiple platforms, in conferences, articles, blog posts, interviews, podcasts, and now festivals, that this is a structural, historical argument, and not one that can be reduced to identity politics, nativism, and essentialism. Yet it's consistently and deliberately misread in this way by many non-Somali academics, researchers, and practitioners in Somali studies. What's being performed here, and this is my argument, is quite revelatory, as it's shown that what we've challenged, systematic exclusion, structural positioning, and relations of power, are then reenacted in the very response to Adan studies as a mechanism of disciplining young Somali scholars for challenging power. As the feminist critical race scholar Sarah Ahmed, who's actually based here at, nearby at Goldsmith, you learn how things are working from what happens to those who challenge how things are working. So I won't go into too much detail or cover everything. As I mentioned, I will have a public piece coming out soon, but I'll focus on one such encounter with power, and that's the Somali Studies International Association Congress in Helsinki this past August. Beyond the implications for Somali studies as an academic field, Adan studies' emergence in the spring raised a more immediate question of what would happen at the SSIA Congress. The Congress offered a unique opportunity to take advantage of the rare convergence of Somali and non-Somali academics and researchers in Somali studies in one place, an event occurring only once every 3 years on average since its first meeting in 1980. Discussions were quietly taking place over the months in email chains and on the Finland-based Somali Research Network listserv, in which several people asked organizers to include a roundtable or panel on these issues at the conference. It was in March that organizers first said that there would be no room for new roundtables or panels at the conference in August. Only in August did SSI leadership first make a public statement on the matter, renaming Adan studies as the Whose Voices debate, once again reducing the stakes here to identity politics and authenticity, and stating SSIA organizers hope to begin a conversation and start a tradition of reflecting on the field of Somali studies with the aim of improving and developing it as a field that is more relevant, robust, and ethical in the knowledge it produces. That's a quote. Then in turn erasing the intellectual labor of the young Somali scholars who had begun that conversation months earlier. They also stated again that there would be no room for Adan studies at the Congress. It was only a day before the Congress, following my public response to organizers, that the organizing committee reversed their position and invited me to participate in a debate. I'd be given 7 minutes as the first of 3 speakers, along with a Finnish researcher and committee member, and a third participant to be decided by the Congress. I agreed to participate on the panel only if the third participant would be a young Somali scholar who had been involved in the debate from the beginning, and was refused my request and told the panel would no longer be balanced. I declined to participate and was told that the panel would go on without me. The decision by organizers was reversed yet again on their first day of the Somali Studies Congress, when it was announced that me and another young Somali scholar would receive the full roundtable. At one point, when an organizer, and this was during the Q&A, the question and answer period, an organizer was asked why it took so long to include the discussion. The answer was that Adan studies was a quarrel, it was too aggressive, it was unconstructive, and therefore inappropriate for the Congress. Of course, it didn't end there. The audio of the roundtable was recorded by a Finland-based Somali journalist who asked for speakers' permission before recording, and we posted that audio online and circulated it on social media in the spirit of accessibility, transparency, and democratizing spaces in which knowledge is produced. Though it was a public venue and public event, over the Somali Research Network listserv, it became an opportunity for 2 senior scholars, including the lead organizer, to discipline and discredit me and other young Somali scholars for sharing the recording under the guise of concern for ethical integrity. Power works through management and control. It operates under the facade of acceptance, masking the refusal and the resistance. It seeks to order the terms of discourse and engagement. It seeks to dismiss critical analyses as unproductive, unconstructive, and unacademic. It seeks to frame critique as emotional, angry, and aggressive. It sustains itself by opening up impossibly tiny spaces for inclusion, disciplining you until you're made to fit, while leaving the structures of exclusion intact. Inclusion in these instances exists only to reinforce and diversify a never-changing norm. So we are at a crossroads, and it remains to be seen whether Adan studies will be taken by non-Somali scholars and practitioners in Somali studies as an opportunity to break the mold, or continue to reify and reinscribe the status quo and their dominance. What's clear is that young Somali scholars have intervened to open up the critical space and make analytical moves towards that transformation, to transform Somali studies into a field that we, Somali scholars and researchers, can live in, not made invisible or rendered non-existent, not at the margins or excluded entirely by its gatekeepers, but at the center. A Somali studies that is theoretically rigorous, methodologically vibrant, and ethically responsible. Thank you.